They don't see the depth and breadth of how these developmental haltings, is the way I think of them, affect their ability to feel like a coherent person. And that's going to be the focus of this conversation. So he gets to my facility at the time, no longer my facility, but he gets to La Fuente, very grateful to have worked there. And we form this wonderful relationship where he finally trusts someone enough to talk about the sexual assaults. Because apparently at none of the other facilities, none of the detoxes, did he talk about being molested. Understandably. Because he, quote unquote, hates himself, especially for being gay. And then I'm going to backtrack one more time, I apologize. Very important incident. So as is often the case for young LGBT folks, queer folks, whatever word, etc., our first crush, our first interest is met with a lot of internal chaos and turmoil because, like, what do? I don't have any role models out there for flirting. Now, nowadays it's way better because you have a bunch of TV shows and things like that, but back in my day, we didn't really have many, let's say, open role models of how to talk to people, flirt with people, approach people. We only had this kind of the straight people around us. And so is that how we're supposed to do it? But what if I don't know that they're gay? What if I don't know that they're bi? What if I don't know that they're queer, etc.? Because how can you know if no one's talking about it? Because that's where I grew up. No one knew. So his first crush was one of his best friends. It happens. And so at some point in one of their kind of spending the night episodes, while both of them were drunk at like 16 or something, he began to physically flirt with his best friend. And he saw mixed signals, so he didn't know what to do with it. So imagine the years of being sexually molested and all the confusion around boundaries that promotes, as we all know. And then he's got this attraction to his friend and the confusion around boundaries there because, you know, especially in the cis gay world, it's kind of like, are you my friend? Are we going to have sex? Are we going to be friends and have sex? Or, well, like, what is the extent of our relationship going to be? Because we could have like 6 different relationships all at once right now if you want, right? There's a bathroom over there, like all that shit. You get what I'm saying? And so like, he was so radically confused on top of all the trauma, on top of all the self-hatred, so he's fumbling around with his friend and ends up essentially molesting his friend at 16 because his friend actually wasn't attracted to him. And then later it came out and sort of was attracted to him. And so it's just this horrible journey of like every time he tries to figure himself out, every time something related to his sexuality shows up, it's bad. That's the story of this guy's life. So he gets the treatment and he starts to just like scrape the surface of some of these things. And as he starts to scrape the surface of some of these things, he just becomes more depressed, as you can imagine, because he's starting to talk about how horrible he feels for probably the first time ever in his life. So he gets close to the end of his residential stay, and he's like, I don't know what I want to do. I'm like, you should probably stick around, maybe do some more therapy, talk about these things. He's like, no, I want to go back to where I'm from because that's where it's safe, right? And that's a miserable idea because where he's from is where he gets wasted all the time. He isolates, he becomes more depressed, more suicidal, things of that nature. So he decides to basically not follow the clinical team's recommendation and goes back to where he's from. Less than a day later, he is wasted. He has spent like a couple $100 on booze and is needing EMT services because that's what kind of drinker he is. He is, I'm going to kill myself drinker. And so he comes back. I think we've spent like 1 or 2 weeks, maybe up to 2 weeks, trying to get him to come to some treatment, whether it's just a detox, just anywhere that you're not going to die, right? And here's the magical moment that changed his life to what he said. He had a fairly close relationship with his mom. They bought him this apartment where he was isolating, drinking, whatever, which is a terrible idea. And his parents were trying to like support him while they knew he was getting messed up. Mom walks in while he's absolutely wasted, vomit is everywhere, bottles are everywhere, cans are, I mean, it's just the stereotype of a story of a very severe substance use disorder. And Mom says, if you want to die, don't do it near me. And she throws his meds at him and walks out and stops talking to him. Now, is that like a good intervention? Technically, no, of course not. I'm not sitting here as a psychologist recommending that families do that. I'm simply saying that this is something that moved him because he had a fairly close relationship with his mom. She was finally done with his self-destruction. Now, again, it's not compassionate, but it resonated for some reason, and that sent him back to us because he trusted us. So he came back a second time, and he finally started to open up about all these things I told you very briefly in a lot of detail. And he finally started to talk about the fact that he hated himself explicitly on a regular basis. Because for a lot of people, they need to talk about that. The second thing that he talked at length about is he has no clue, quote unquote, how to be gay. Now that's a phrase that makes a lot of sense to a lot of us, I think, because a lot of us had no roadmap, right? And when I started to work with people in our community more and more over the course of my career, I started to wonder, like, what happens that we don't have a roadmap? What's the consequence of us not having roadmaps, right? And so let me kind of segue away from his story. I'll come back to it and start talking more about the concepts I came here to discuss, which is delayed adolescence. So here's my pitch, and I'm going to quickly refer to a note so I don't mess this up. I did write a paper, which you all have access to. I think it was sent out in the invite, so please take a look and tear it apart and tell me I'm wrong or tell me I'm a fraud, because I would rather people criticize me than like just go along with whatever I say because I'm a doctor. You know what I mean? So here's the concept I kind of modified from other concepts. So we know from, like, let's say CAS, right? Do most of you know CAS's identity stage theory of, like, there's the 6 stages of LGBT adolescent development and all that stuff, right? So all these models of identity development I think are very good. They really capture a lot of people. Now, one of the problems with many of these models of development, especially like the CAS models, it's mostly focused on cis gay males, right? It's kind of a limited model, right? So it doesn't really touch on lesbians and trans folks and queer folks and non-binary folks. It was developed at a time when, you know, the number one group of people studied by researchers were the cis gay males, right? So it's just a historical difference, right? So I'm trying to add on to that because there are new models since CAS came out with their model, but like I think there's more we should talk about from a developmental perspective because, as most of you probably know, people don't just magically develop cognitive distortions. People don't just magically develop a substance use disorder. Something happens progressively over life. No one just like goes from 0 to 100 with their drug use. It's very statistically rare that that happens. So I started to look at my patients. I started to look at what the research said about, you know, identity development for our community, and there was very little there other than like CAS's model and a couple other smaller, less research models. So I thought, what could we add on to this to make it make more sense, right? To clarify more. So my thought was, maybe we're missing something about how we come to understand our sense of self. Because most of you probably know that our sense of self that kind of lives in our brain, right, is this like model. It's a schema. It's almost like a pie chart, right, where there's a pie chart with 10 pieces to it. So like I'm a psychologist, I'm a bisexual, I'm a COO, I'm a male, I'm 6 foot tall. I lost some hair, so I don't know anymore. But like, my pie chart has these different slices to it, right? And most of these slices are either a biological reality or a social identity, right? And so the thing that started to strike me about a lot of the people I worked with, especially at La Fuente and other places, is that it seems like there were 2 different pie charts that people worked off of. Or it's like 2 pieces of the pie chart just kind of like magically were pulled out, right? So the vast majority of patients I worked with, they kind of knew their social identity with regard to like their academic interests, with regard to like maybe their interest in art or music or sports or whatever it is. So they had a lot of their social identities picked out. And they were pretty coherent. They made sense together because that's what coherence means, right? It means to make sense together, right? So a lot of people I've noticed have this very coherent sense of self, except for there's this gay piece over here. Or there's this bi piece over here, or there's this trans piece over here, or there's this queer piece over here. But the rest of the pie chart, the other 8 pieces are fine, but these 2 are kind of over here. So your sexuality and your gender are kind of like sort of over here if you're in the queer community, but the rest of you is fine. So your professional life is one thing. Your social life is one thing. All these things are one thing, but then like this piece of you is kind of separate, is what I noticed for a lot of the patients I work with. And so I hope this is starting to make sense to some of you, where it's like there's the regular you that the world sees when you're going to get coffee, and then there's like the gay you or the trans you or whatever. That's what it seems like. And so what I've noticed with a lot of the people I've worked with is this disconnection, this disintegration, right, means that our sense of self is pretty incoherent, because it's not like these 2 pieces are smaller than the occupational piece or the athletic piece, or the dating piece. These two pieces are, I'd say, bigger, I'd say, for our community than for maybe straight people, would be my guess. I think we tend to focus on them a lot and think about them a lot. So that's what this concept of delayed adolescence is about. Because I think there are three phases that we go through when we experience what I would call the phenomenon of delayed adolescence. So the first phase, just to make sure I'm saying this correctly, is I say we have this kind of delay in identity discovery. So if you think about typical adolescence, if you look at all the kind of standard developmental psych research on how adolescents grow up and develop their identity, all the kind of stuff based on mostly hetero Western ideals, that's what I'm pulling from because that's mostly what we have, so not to be exclusionary. But if you look at typical models of adolescence, when you're in that first phase of the three phases of adolescence, you tend to have like this weird, confusing experience of a bunch of new hormones, and typically socially like a bunch of new relationships, because typically around early adolescence is when you go to more complicated social schools and neighborhoods. You develop a little more autonomy and a little more complexity to your life than when you were in elementary school. And so when you get to that second phase, your job is to figure out how to start putting these pieces together. So if you think about like early high school for most kids in early high school are starting to figure out like, what clique do I belong to? And how do I kind of have my own life separate from my family, right? Because typically that early high school, freshman, sophomore period, roughly speaking, is when generally speaking, you start to individuate from like the family systems perspective. So as you start to individuate, you start to kind of add pieces to that pie chart and make them yourself. And try them out, because the great thing about early adolescence is you get to try things out. You get to like fumble around, talk to people, date people, etc. Be friends with people, try sports, try social clubs, whatever it is, try music, hairstyles, all these fun things, and figure out if that's you, right? It's like the teenagers are constantly morphing and changing, right? But what if that doesn't go as smoothly for us as it does for the hetero folks? Because what if, this is my first phase, which is disintegration discovery. So the first phase of delayed adolescence is where you start to develop a disintegrated self. Whereas most hetero folks tend to, I think, more easily develop an integrated self. Because again, in that first phase, you're like stumbling around figuring out who you're attracted to, right? So the stereotype in the Western cis hetero world is like, the clumsy, awkward boy punches the girl on the shoulder. And that is the smart way of saying, I'm really interested in you for some reason, but I can't understand because of puberty, right? But do we get to do that? Is it safe for a lot of people in our community to do that? Like I grew up in the South, and I grew up in a town where there were no openly queer people of any color, flavor, texture, etc. And so I literally had no clue if I was going to go punch someone on the shoulder, if I was going to get punched in the face. So it stands to reason that even though things are better, thank goodness, and they hopefully will continue to get better, a lot of people had this experience of starting to disintegrate that piece of yourself and shove it into a closet somewhere and only bring it out for a rainy day, or when you need to, or when it matters. Whereas the average hetero kids could just like go flirt. Talk to their friends about who they're flirting with. So they get to start to integrate their friend life with their sexuality. But we start to separate those two things because we don't know if it's okay to talk to our friends about that. Are you starting to see the disintegration I'm talking about? So a lot of my first thought is this first phase is you start to disintegrate maybe these two pieces, your sexuality and your gender, from the rest of your sense of self. Your self-concept starts to separate. These two slices stay over here, but the other 8 slices, which are perfectly socially acceptable and not confusing and not contentious, everyone can see. Your family can see them, all this kind of stuff. Does that make sense so far? So the first phase, is disintegration discovery. And so you're discovering your sexual gender minority self, but it's kind of like disintegrated from the rest of you. And then you get to the second phase, which I call circumscription. So if you think about the second phase of adolescence, where you're starting to like develop your athletic self, your academic self, you're starting to figure out if you want to go to college or trade school or family business or whatever it is, right? Instagram star, I don't know what kids do nowadays, but you're starting to figure it out, and that's kind of second phase of adolescence. You're starting to figure out who you want to become, right? So in that second phase, as you're starting to figure out who you want to become, you start to hyper-focus on things, right? We see this with adolescents. Yeah, I've worked with them, you probably have worked with them too, or you have them. Adolescents become super focused. Their identity becomes this thing. I am this now. I am a goth. I am whatever. I'm going to be the next whoever. I'm going to be the next Ariana Grande or something. I don't know. But you become this thing, right? And so adolescents start trying on outfits of who they want to be, right? And so after you disintegrate and start to separate, you start to circumscribe, is what I think is the second phase, where you start to hyper-focus on one thing, which is you start to hyper-focus on this thing you've hidden over here in the closet, your sexual identity. Because maybe you're getting along with your social self, your academic self, your family self, your sports self, your career self, right? Maybe you're okay with those things, and those things are kind of cohering, they're making sense together. But because this has been separate, you can't help but focus on it. Like, show of hands, all of you who are kind of in the queer community with me, how many of you had an easy time like just ignoring your sexual self as a kid? Anyone? Okay, good. Okay, one of you. Okay, good. That's fine. But most people know. Most of us were like, oh, there's this thing over here I have to pay attention to. And it's different than everybody else. And that's what I call circumscription. You become hyper-focused on something that the average heterosexual person wouldn't be hyper-focused on. How many heterosexual adolescents have to hyper-focus on their sexuality when it's just kind of a given that most people they know are like this? So we become hyper-focused on it is my second phase. So first it's disintegrated, then second it's hyper-focused on. Does that check out so far? So we're through phase 2 and I haven't been shot yet. That's good. So then the question is, once we get into kind of the later adolescent period, what happens as we've disintegrated, we've pulled apart, and we've hyper-focused on it? What's the consequence of that? Well, let me ask all of you, less rhetorically. When something is felt off about who you are as a person, is it easy to ignore? Not particularly. Did any of you happen to find convenient solutions to the confusion and psychological pain related to being different? Perhaps drugs? Just a question. So that's the third phase for me, right? So the typical third phase of adolescence for most normative, cis-normative kids is they get past that high school phase, they get into college, and they have this sort of coherent picture. They kind of know who they are. They have an integrated sexual identity and romantic identity and family identity. They've individuated some, so they kind of know who they are separate from their family, but still part of it, right? So they've created a coherent sense of self more or less for the average person at 18, 20, whatever it is. Not that it's solid. And they start doing things in their regular life to be more autonomous and reaffirm those things that make sense about themselves together. But if we've already separated that piece of ourself, or those two pieces of ourself, and we start to like hyper-focus on it, so now we have two things we're focused on. The normal me that everybody sees, and then this piece over here, which I think is important, in fact, it's probably radically important, but I can't stop thinking about it. So that leads me to the third phase, which I call acting out and synthesis. Synthesis in the standard philosophy sense, like Hegel, etc. Like there's antithesis, thesis, synthesis. Again, too highfalutin for Thursday at 12 something. But generally speaking, the idea is you have to do a great deal of acting out to get to the place of synthesis. You have to do some exploding, some struggling, some crisis. There has to be some degree of crisis for you to figure out who you are. And the reason I say that is a normative thing in the model of delayed adolescence is because you were supposed to do that years ago, and you could never do it, right? So the idea is for the typical cis-heteronormative kid, you're acting out in high school. You're pushing back on your parents. You're pushing back on your friends. You're trying to figure out who you are. You're having fights with people. You're doing all these things as an integrated person. So your whole self gets the opportunity, or your developing whole self, whatever, how developed it is, gets the opportunity to struggle and fight. But if this piece of yourself, these two pieces maybe, don't get to openly struggle, if you don't get to openly fight with your parents about who you want to date as a teenager, as many cis-hetero people get to, you don't get to fight with your friends, don't date her, date him, etc., right? then when did you have the experience to learn how to negotiate those conflicts and those crises? You starting to see the point? The point is, a lot of what we should have done, or should have been able to do, or should have felt safe to do, relatively speaking, when we were 13 to 16 to 18, a lot of people in the queer community start to do it 20, 22, 24, 26, much like my patient. Because you don't really know how to do it because you had no role models. And number two, it wasn't safe to show this part of yourself to the world and talk to the rest of the world. So all these things that you should have figured out how to do as an adolescent, like fight with people, like figure your identity out, like integrate these things. If it's only safe to start integrating these things when you go to your first gay bar at 21 or whatever, you are now 5, 6, 7 years behind. If your openly gay self, openly trans self is finally affirmed when you go to the club at 18 or 20, even though for most hetero folks it's openly affirmed at 13, oh how cute, he kissed her, etc. Right? At 13. But if you had to wait till 18, that's 5 years where you never learned how to integrate that piece of yourself into your bigger picture sense of self. So my hypothesis is this. In addition to all the things that we know to be social determinants of health for our community, stigma, shame, drug use, mental illness, right? We have 5-fold increased risk of having a substance use disorder compared to the hetero population, right? Now the great thing is we're twice as likely to seek out treatment compared to the hetero population, so that's a good sign. But we also suffer more. And so my hypothesis is that because we never learned how to have an integrated sense of self, as our peers did at the same time as our peers did, we have this disconnect and this split in who we think we ought to be, because there's the queer part of us that's over here, and there's the rest of us. And for some reason, these two things don't mix, because they didn't mix as kids. They didn't mix as adolescents, early adolescence, middle adolescence. And they start to finally mix when you go to that first club, that first bar, etc. So you're now 5 to 7 years behind your peers who already started to put the pieces together. And so as I've kind of queried you already, like how easy is it to deal with a part of yourself you're ashamed of and hiding and kind of separate from? Not very easy. So my hypothesis is if we hide a piece of ourselves because we're afraid it's not safe, it's not okay, we disintegrate that piece of ourself from the rest of ourself. Does that make sense? Because I'm using the word self a lot. Yeah? So when you have this, in a psychoanalytic sense, when you have this split off piece of yourself, it causes all sorts of hell internally. Not a very sophisticated phrase, but it's the truth. And so here's the problem with all that hell. There are great solutions to all of that hell. One of the best solutions is drugs. Drugs is the best solution, in my opinion, as an addiction treatment provider. And the reason I say that is because, literally speaking, nothing works quicker and in a more potent way than a substance. As mammals, our first go-to when we feel dysregulated is supposed to be people. That's supposed to be, relationship is supposed to be our first choice when we're dysregulated. That's how we're hardwired by evolution. But if you already think yourself is not okay, and you can't show this piece of yourself to the world, or it's very dangerous to do so, why would you seek out relationships? And if there are other people who are miserable just like you, who are doing these behaviors like smoking weed and drinking all these fun things, maybe that's what I'll do, because I feel just like them. It's birds of a feather. Oh, you're miserable? Oh, you've been in the closet too? I'll go do that. Let's go to that really loud club where you can't hear people and it's really dark and you can't really make eye contact and you can't really feel connected because it's terrifying to feel connected. So I'm going to go to West Hollywood. I'm sorry to sound like this, but I'm going to go to West Hollywood and not really make eye contact and not really hear people and not really feel close to people. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to get high or I'm going to drink and I'm going to artificially feel close to people that I have no business knowing. Now, I'm not saying that West Hollywood's bad. I'm simply saying that there's no sane reason, if you hate yourself, to go to a place where you can't connect with people. Because your only solution for that self-hate is to learn how to connect. And there's no place at Mickey's where you can learn how to self-soothe and love yourself. It's not going to happen. So back to this young man, you can already see how he experienced delayed adolescence. He wasn't able to come out at all. He was in the closet until he was like 18. So he was secretly flirting with his best friend. And so when he came to my facility the first time, he said, I hate myself. I was like, huh, what's that about? It ended up being about, the sexual assaults, but it also ended up being about the fact that he had no clear picture of who he was in his head. Because there's like his academic self, the skateboarder self, the surfer self, the family self. All these things made sense to him. And then there's like this corner over here where the gay part of him lived that sort of came out to play and his family sort of acknowledged and he sort of understood. So a lot of our work together, which I think helped him stay sober while I was with him, because I'm not responsible for his sobriety, but one of the things that helped was him developing a more coherent sense of self, where each of the pieces equally mattered and made sense together. That's the whole principle of narrative therapy, right? Is you help people make a coherent story out of their life experience. So that's what I did with him. And it helped with the trauma as well a little bit. So the idea is, many of these queer people who come to our facilities with serious mental health issues, serious substance use disorders, trauma, one of the big challenges that I don't think gets addressed enough, I'm sure many of you do very good work and you support people who do very good work, I think something we're all missing is this delay in adolescence. And I think something that we stigmatize are these behaviors. So let me go back to my comment about West Hollywood real quick. That is the land of adolescence. That's what that is. And so I'm not judging it, I'm trying to describe it technically. Which is, if you weren't able to do all the rebellious, fun, scandalous, confusing, identity-finding things when you were 13 or 15 or 18, what better than to do it in your own little safe zip code with drugs and loud music, so you can kind of like soften the blow of when people don't like you or they're not going to flirt with you or hook up with you or whatever it is. How wonderful that we have this cushion of like loud music or this cushion of alcohol or whatever it is. Wonderful to have these cushions. Also, you know what's a better cushion? Sex. If I don't feel validated by you right now, then I'm going to go find you. Or you. Or both of you. Which is exactly what adolescents do. And there's nothing wrong with being hypersexual. That's a perfectly, neurodivergent difference that's acceptable. But there's a radical difference between being hypersexual and compulsively using people to feel important. Those are not the same thing. And what do adolescents do when they get rejected? Well, they go right back and find somebody else. Right? All these stereotypical high school movies you see. So-and-so gets rejected, the next day goes and dates so-and-so, their best friend or whatever. Boy, that sounds like a lot of these queer-friendly spaces. You know what I mean? So there's a delayed adolescence problem that we all get to, I think, work together on by doing two things. My call to action is two things. Number one, it's all right, we get to help people grow up. We get to be the good parents that they never had. Right? Many of you can probably recall in your own lives a wish for parents to talk with you about these things. Talk with you about what was it like to be queer of some kind and want to date and be interested in a friend and be interested in so-and-so. I want to go hang out with these people. But you really couldn't tell them because I'm going to tell you the story that fits the straight world. That sound relatable to anybody? And so that is one big challenge for all of us, is to help these people with these serious mental health and substance use disorders have this developmentally appropriate parenting experience in your clinical services, whether it's a family therapy session, an individual session, a group, whatever it is, right? So I'm not creating a brand new model of therapy. I'm just talking about a concept we can all play with when we do process groups and when we do therapy, which is what kind of parenting experiences did you need to integrate your identity that you didn't get? Now, some people will luck out and have had very open parents. My patient G did not have that experience because he hid it, right? And something that I wrote in the paper that I didn't talk about very much here is that This is not the blame the parents, blame society conversation. This is me saying that a lot of kids, much like many of us, chose to hide, not because our parents were terrible people, but because we weren't sure, because we didn't have role models, because we didn't see other people doing this, so we don't know, right? If you have a role model, you can feel more comfortable, especially as a teenager, like going after it and trying it. You can experiment and play. But when you don't have a role model, what do? Do you risk it? If you are online, if you're a very online teenager and you read all about bullying and suicide and all these things, do you think you're going to want to openly talk about these things? Okay. So our job is to validate that maybe they didn't feel comfortable being out. And figuring out how that disconnection, that disintegration of maybe these two pieces of their sense of self and the other pieces is making it hard for them to accept other parts of their self. Because if you can't accept one thing about yourself, it makes it a lot harder to accept other things. This young man didn't want to be sober. He didn't even want to go to AA, even though he had a very good I considered a very good sponsor. He had like good culture around him. And he didn't want to connect, not only because he hated himself, but he couldn't see himself in other people. Because the people he was around were more integrated. They were more mature. They were more developed. So it was like a foreign experience trying to talk to someone who was more adult than him. He felt like a little kid. They felt like adults to him. So helping him understand how to integrate himself so he could feel like he was part of, as opposed to down here, was really important. My second call to action is to try to not support adolescent behavior, but also not stigmatize it when it shows up in your facility, which is a tricky, fine line to walk. Because again, you just heard me kind of rant against West Hollywood for the purposes of talking about the problematic adolescent behavior that we see there. That's not saying that they shouldn't go to these queer-friendly spaces. It's to say that there is more to life than the social scene in these popular zip codes. And that adolescent hierarchy thing is not going to solve the problem for them, right? You have to do more to show them what an integrated sense of self looks like and walk them through that. In fact, even if you need to, you can pull out kind of old school developmental psych textbooks and talk about these stages of adolescent development and ask them what happened, what didn't happen with you, if you need like a structure for it. And then you can normalize it when it happens in your facility, because it's going to happen in your facility. They're going to act out. They're going to flirt. They're going to try to make out. They're going to, all these things, right? They're going to do all these things that violate your rules and want you to kick them out. All of which is normal, and you shouldn't put up with bad behavior, for sure. But as good parents, we also want to normalize and contextualize. We want to add meaning and circumstance to what they're doing. Because in your facility may be the first time they've ever had healthier peers and healthier parents. So they're kind of confused about that, probably. They probably want to push on your boundaries, not just because addicts like to push on boundaries, so that's true, but it's also true that when you're a teenager, that's how you figure yourself out. So if we can destigmatize that process, normalize it to some degree, but not accept bad behavior, then what we can do is we can help people integrate a lot quicker. So there's stuff we can do at the individual level to help people understand their developmental delays. And there's stuff we can do at the kind of facility systems culture level to be okay with this behavior, but not accept it. Right? Because if your patients start sleeping with each other, that's the end of your facility. That's a bad thing. But if you can put a stop to it, and you can explain what's happening from a systemic developmental perspective, maybe they'll be more willing to comply with the rules and the boundaries. We all know how powerful the word no is. And when you say it the right way, with love, with understanding, it actually works for teens, just like it works with our patients. So that's the concept of delayed adolescence. It's these three phases that queer people go through that regular cis-hetero folks don't necessarily go through, where we disintegrate and we separate these pieces of ourselves. And then secondarily, we circumscribe. We hyper-focus on this as if it's special and requires excessive attention, whereas our hetero folks, they're not hyper-focused on their sexuality or their gender. It's just a given. And the third phase is this crisis phase where they act out and do a bunch of things that probably aren't good for them or anyone else, but then they can get to synthesis. They can figure out who they are. They can develop a coherent sense of self with the right support. So the drug use, the hypersexual, excessive coping, all that stuff is expectable if you're a teenager, not if you're a young adult. But if you're a young adult who's developmentally a teenager, that's a different story. And that's the story I wanted to tell today. So, any questions? Yeah.
That was amazing. Thank you for so succinctly reducing my life.
No.
But yeah, that's like, yeah, it was uncomfortable, but
okay.
Comfortable. A couple of ideas I want to throw in the ring.
Please.
Like, I had the same experience going back to WeHo after getting sober.
Yeah.
And seeing it for this sort of shallow carnival, you know, that it can be.
Yeah.
It's interesting that there are other purposes that it serves. Right?
Correct.
Emile Durkheim talks of collective effervescence, where the tribe comes together and loses individuality for the sake of the whole.
Which is great.
And so when you go there, you have that experience of kind of like almost getting this placeholder identity. Like when I came out later in life, when I reached the Beyonce phase.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I
yeah.
didn't like Beyonce before, and then all of a sudden the new album came out. I'm like, oh, cool! I'm just like, it's the scout bag.
Yeah.
Like, I've reached that point now.
Yeah.
So I think this like the placeholder avatar, the placeholder identity might be an interesting supplement. A placeholder it is.
Yeah.
And the goal is to further refine and saying, well, yeah, Beyonce's cool, but I don't need to like Beyonce to be gay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing as well is I think because it's important to look at the individual as part of the whole. The issue is the late adolescence by virtue of a culture which doesn't talk and openly confront these things, right? That's the seed of the problem.
Yeah.
WeHo also, and all of the gay ghettos out there, serve this very political thing. I think it's like bling culture in black culture, right?
Yeah.
That I'm here, I'm going to show that I'm a success despite how much you've tried to fuck me over and send me up.
Right.
That there's a political salience to having places like WeHo because essentially it says to society, we're here, take us seriously, accept us. And so if those are fixed, we go back and we create a culture where the disintegrations are less likely to take place. So I guess you know what I'm saying, is that we don't poo-poo WeHo.
No.
At the individual level, maybe, but at the social and political level, it serves a purpose.
Yes, absolutely. These are the safe spaces that allow us to be separate from, but also unique. I agree. And I think there's nothing wrong with that inherently, such that that is not the final way of functioning. So like I think of Cass's identity development model. So like the 4th or 5th stage, I forget, is where you're very politically active and kind of radical as a person when you're coming out. And then when you get to that final integrated 6th stage of Cass's model, those things still matter, but they're not as big. They're not as big a piece of who you are, right? And that's what I think about those places like, I think you called them the queer ghettos. And I think that's good. And I think that they serve a purpose. And the question would be, for the people who are really struggling, do they consistently help? Like in the balance beam of things, are they consistently very helpful or consistently not very helpful? To what degree? And I think that's, like you said, it's an individual thing that's negotiated. And as treatment providers, my goal is to help individuals make better choices about how they show up. Because you can be politically involved in West Hollywood or Silver Lake or something like that, and that's fine. But then nothing is perfectly all good. Right, and so we have to be able to educate these people about the possible consequences, because when you're a teenager, you'll do whatever. Oh yeah, I'm for this cause, whatever it is, right? Such and such rights matter is the catchphrase. And that's good, but it's not the end of the story. And it's not necessarily only going to be good for your development as a person, because it might be helping you act out more, depending upon the situation. So I think it's a yes and no, depending upon the person, right? But I do appreciate your comments. Yeah.
For that particular patient, once he came back after his, coming to Jesus moment, how often do you see a patient coming to you, like, ready, open, wanting to accept the help? Like, what is that process for an individual? Like, I know each person is different.
Yeah.
But what have you seen, like, because most places they have a 12-step program, or they have a year program. Yeah. What have you noticed, like, with this model for your patients?
So when I've been able to employ this framework with people, it's easier to get them into a headspace of acceptance. Easier doesn't mean easy, just easier. because we're now talking about experiences, like you said, that are very relatable. It's a very simple way of kind of making something relatable. In terms of like numbers or data, I couldn't even tell you. I mean, I would want to quote a study or something, but this is a brand new thing, which is not particularly like researched or something. I haven't even really submitted this paper to a journal at this point. So, it's just kind of like, I would encourage anyone to pull out any tool in their tool bag that helps you become more relatable. And so I think this is just another way to make it more relatable. And it does decrease resistance because it speaks to something that they have a hard time articulating and making sense of.
Have you noticed like a lot of your patients really come through with this type of treatment?
I mean, it's not technically a type of treatment, but it is a concept I use in treatment. And the people I've worked with where I've talked about it with automatically have his reaction, which is like, yeah, that made a lot of sense to me and it was uncomfortable, which is the expectation. So does it solve anything? Of course not. Nothing solves anything, but it definitely makes it easier to relate. And it normalizes a lot of what they think is abnormal, which is my goal.
Thank you, Dr. Lockwood. It was amazing. It made beautiful sense. And it totally related in my mind, because when we hear something related to something that we already understand and make sense of, that's definitely the way that I perceive most of the clients, no matter what gender identity or sexual preference they have in general, because a lot of times people have been using drugs since before they developed.
Sure.
So they have a delayed adolescence or adulthood or developmental growth in many different ways.
Right.
And it's something that I think is very effective and used in all ways with our clientele as in the SUD world a lot. And so to identify it specifically as something that leads to SUD in that community, it was beautifully put together, and I just really thought it was wonderful, and I would like to read your paper.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad it made sense. Yeah.
There were two pieces. Thank you again, but I remember having this conversation because I remember how this conversation around when we're brought into this world, you're put in a blue blanket or a pink blanket, right? So gender construct.
Yeah.
We learn that the prince kisses the princess and they become a king and a queen.
Yeah.
So all of these things, it leads to separating that part that I know is different right out the gate.
Right.
To something else.
Right.
But I remember distinctly in my life where the people that I had found as my chosen family and friends that I could go out and experience the gay lifestyle with, meet a drag queen and go boy, do the things, right?
Yeah.
I acted out, and though they had similar experiences, they didn't.
Right.
At least not yet. Maybe my downfall happened a lot sooner than that. But I remember the ism being very, very clear at that point in time, and so I am very interested in that. These folks had, we bonded over the troubled background or how difficult it was to come out, or the fact that, though the hetero world gets to experience all of those things in their early teens to late teens, we don't get to experience it until 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. But I also have the same maturity of an 18-year-old with all this judgment of the world around me and stuff, or the shame and the guilt and all that kind of stuff. When talking about this structure, this modality for
just a framework
to address these types of issues, how often do you see it that when people don't act out at that younger age, and they maybe do find that they find their acceptance or their validation? I live in Palm Springs, I see the party goers well into the 50s and 60s who never really left that adolescence and stuff. How common is that, would you say?
I don't know. I mean, that's a great data question. I wish that there was some researcher who was out there doing kind of epidemiological surveys who was asking, how old are you and how long have you been going to the clubs? I don't have that data, but we should do it. I think we should totally do it.
Don't do it, data.
We should. No, we should. Because here's the thing is, if we had some rough estimation, we know for a fact that there's a 5-fold greater risk of having a substance use disorder if you're in our community. We know that that's a replicated thing since the early 80s. So that's a fact that we know. If we had some comparable fact, if my model is basically somehow true or reasonably reasonable, if we could use that in a predictive sense to say, like, if you don't go through adolescence somewhat typically, then you're more likely to have a longer term party lifestyle, if you want to think of it like that. And then what are the consequences of that socially, psychologically, etc.? I would love to have something like that. I don't have it. Yeah, I'm happy to say I don't know.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. But I think we see it, like you say. We see it all the time where these 40, 50, 60-year-olds are 16. And it's like, wow, oh, I see, interesting. Okay.
Oh, the last question. I was when you're bringing up this framework, what types of like therapeutic approaches or modalities do you think couple best with something like this?
I like narrative therapy a lot, and it's not the most evidence-supported treatment, but the reason I like it is because it focuses on the concept of coherence. So things have to make sense together. So you have this disparate part of your life over here, that's the closeted you or whatever it is, and there's the socially accepted you. These are disintegrated. So narrative therapy helps you integrate those by looking at the common themes, the dissimilarities. I also like ACT a lot, acceptance and commitment therapy, because it allows you to contextualize. I think context is very important because we tend to over-attribute our behavior to like who we think we are. But the truth of the matter is, in a very different circumstance, you probably wouldn't be that person. So like where I come from, there were no clubs, no bars. There was a lot of meth because Missouri was the meth capital of the world at the time. But other than that, I didn't have any other stuff. So I couldn't have done most of those things that a lot of people do. But if I lived in Palm Springs, it's a very different story, right? So I like ACT because it contextualizes. I like narrative therapy because it builds coherence. And I use a lot of dynamic work with these people because typically, in a technical sense, people introject. They develop senses of self or identity, or they take in pieces of identity that are bad for them, harmful, negative, distorted, etc. So those are the three modalities I typically work with, but you could do a lot of this with most modalities.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any last minute questions?
Just one, I mean, I feel like IFS would be like a natural
It could.
place for this to go, because those parts,
Mhm.
you know, that like really just exile, you know, at
Yeah.
that point.
Yeah, no, I like IFS for sure. It makes a lot of sense, especially in the context of your broader family ecosystem for sure. Yeah.
I love it. Thank you so much.
For
That's
sure.
incredible. There you go.
Pass the mic.
Any more mics?
Let's thank Dr. Lockwood one more time. That was fabulous. Thank you.